Professor Federici is Professor Emerita and Teaching Fellow at Hofstra University, where she also held an appointment as a Professor of Social Science. From 1984 to 1986, she taught at the University of Port Harcourt in Nigeria. In 1972, she founded the International Feminist Collective with Selma James and Maria Della Costa. The collective launched the campaign for wages for housework, which foregrounds the gender division of labor as central to ongoing capitalist forms of exploitation and expropriation. Professor Federici has worked for many years in a variety of activist feminist projects, such as Women in Nigeria and Ni Una Menos, the Argentinian feminist organization. Dr. Federici is a leading feminist theoretician of Marxist feminist theory, women's history, and the history and theory of the commons. Her field-shaping 2004 book, Caliban and the Witch, Women, the Body, and Primitive Accumulation, has been translated into over 20 languages. The book is, in her own words, an attempt to rethink Marx's analysis of primitive accumulation from a feminist viewpoint. Pressing us to account for the execution of hundreds of thousands of witches at the beginning of the modern era, Professor Federici brilliantly demonstrates how and why, quote, the rise of capitalism was coeval with the war against women, unquote. Furthermore, in her transformative and reperiodizing reading, capitalism was not the product of an evolutionary development, but instead a counter-revolution that destroyed the possibilities that had emerged from the anti-feudal struggle, which, if realized, might have spared us the immense destruction of lives and the natural environment that has marked the advance of capitalist relations worldwide. Indeed, one of the most compelling aspects of the story that she tells is its rootedness in practices of struggle. Quote, only if we evoke these struggles can we understand the role that women had in the crisis of feudalism and why their power had to be destroyed for capitalism to develop as it was by the 3-century-long persecution of the witches, unquote. One of the central concepts of Caliban and the Witch was the struggle on and for the commons, by which feudal peasants sought to take control and preserve their access to the use of non-cultivated lands, including woods, lakes, hills, and other natural resources that they considered collective property. In a series of essays collected in her 2019 book, Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Commons, Professor Federici revisits the idea of the commons to call attention to what she calls the new enclosures that are part of the ongoing process of primitive accumulation. Like the old enclosures of the 16th and 17th centuries, these new enclosures aim to end the communal control over the means of subsistence, forcing people into new and old forms of servitude, debt, and labor. Another aspect of the new enclosures, she writes, is the attack on our reproduction that makes us mutants as well as migrants, the disappearance of the rainforest, the hole in the ozone layer, the pollution of the air and the seas, all combine to destroy our earthly commons, unquote. Chronicling human suffering and earth devastation, Professor Federici's focus on the commons also makes visible the many political struggles that resist the new enclosures and instantiate different ways of living collectively with others beyond the nation-state form. The politics of the commons, she writes, are today the expression of this alternative world. Professor Federici understands that any attempt to invoke the politics of the commons today will be seen as the height of naivete, surrounded as we are by wars and economic and ecological crises. She also recognizes that any attempt to revisit the history of the commons must remain alert to the fact that the commons have not always been egalitarian forms of social organization. Even today, in several indigenous communities of Africa and South America, she observes, women do not have the same participation rights. Nevertheless, Federici insists that the idea of the commons has world-building potential. Please join me in welcoming Professor Federici.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for the introduction, and thank you for having invited me, to this conference. And I want to congratulate the organizer of the conference for tackling such a crucial, important topic, today more important than ever, as we are witnessing, a process of mass destruction of the communal form of living across the globe. Today, I'm going to make a few comments, a few points about what the commons represent for us and what kind of struggle we need to engage in order to reinvent, recuperate, reclaim communal forms of existence, whereby we understand forms of existence in which we share the wealth of the world, in which we are collaborating, cooperating in the production of life, and rather than competing, and also have mutual ties of care with each other and also with the natural world, because we cannot approach our relationship to nature in a purely appropriative relation, but we have, in fact, to guarantee, as indigenous population of the Americas have done for centuries, we have guaranteed that we not only take, but also give back and maintain the earth, the commons, for the next generation. I'm going to read my comments, which are very simple, but I want to say that I've kind of renamed the title of my presentation as Commons Against Capitalism and the Lesson from Palestine. I decided to introduce a reference to Palestine because, not only because in a way it is the issue of the day, but also because what we see in the war that the government of Israel is waging against the Palestinian people, and the government of the United States, of course, what we see in this war, it's really the manifestation, an extreme manifestation of a logic that today is driving capitalist development in every part of the world. It is the logic that certainly has been driving the program of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, whose practically reason of existence has been to force system of privatization of land, and also to force governments across the world in the name of a debt crisis, economic recovery, agricultural development, to open up their country to a great variety of extractivist companies, as well as agribusiness, and even companies for the production of green grass, for green gasoline, the production of green gasoline, all of which have in fact caused massive forms of dispossession, impoverishment, and not accidentally, given birth to migratory movements and the proliferation of refugee camps in every part of the world. So this is a logic that basically systematically, structurally subordinates, the acquisition of property, the accumulation of wealth in private hands, subordinates the concern for human life to the acquisition of property and capital accumulation. So the consideration, therefore, that we have to give to the question of Palestine is something that takes it beyond its border, as extreme and cruel, and clearly directed to, in a sense, the erasure of the Palestinian population and Palestine as a country in the Middle East. Nevertheless, we can say that in many, many respects, Palestine is the world, that the same type of dynamics that we observe have actually taken place, in different forms, across many parts, particularly of the so-called global South, which is nothing else but the former colonial world, which now is being recolonized, except in new ways, both by financial means, as well, of course, as wars and the militarization of everyday life. Because in fact, these processes of dispossession are also accompanied, by a state of permanent warfare. Given that, which has, of course, a major impact on the ecological environment, incredibly destructive impact on the ecological environment. We can only imagine, for example, what will be the ecological situation in Palestine, for the decades to come, given the amount of destruction, of the agricultural setup and the poisoning of the earth, created by all the lethal bombs that have been dropped on it. So that, this permanent warfare, this process of permanent warfare is particularly directed against the ties that hold communities together and the means the community have for their reproduction. They are not any longer, the welfare now has new characteristic, is no longer directed to the clashes between different states, but in fact is very much directed, it's like a continuation of the process of dispossession. It's a continuation and the creation of the condition for a process of dispossession, for a process of destruction of the commons. So under this condition, it is very clear that when we think of reconstituting, reconstructing, communal forms of reproduction, we have to first think of engaging, of broad movements that can reverse the trend that I have described. Clearly, broad movement against war. By the way, today war is one of the major, major causes I was mentioning before, of ecological devastation. Broad movements against war, against militarization, movement again also against international trade agreement and the policies of international institutions that are pushing towards the process, of displacement and privatization of land. These movements are extremely important. I would also mention the importance of movement, and here I would put women's-led, feminist-led movement for the reevaluation of reproductive work. Clearly, women have been the first who have been affected, negatively affected, by the destruction of the commons, by the destruction of relation that people have with the land, with nature, with the forest. It's very clear, for instance, that every form of ecological destruction has a direct effect on women's work. to the extent, as I mentioned many, many times in my work, the women are the first, the primary subject of the process of reproduction. No, they are also the ones who see immediately not only their work escalated, but also their whole relation to their family, immediately impacted when they cannot provide, for example, for clean water to their children, to their family, when they cannot provide food because the soil is poisoned, when they have to walk miles and miles to acquire what years before was available in their milpa, in their garden, in their fields, and now instead has to be fetched many kilometers away because in the river, in the ponds, in the fields, you have the residue of gold mining, mercury, and other forms of poisoning. So the question of the commoning certainly cannot be addressed without major form of major movement that are addressing, the trend of capitalism towards really increasing displacement of millions in rural areas, for instance, towards the city. You probably know that last year, the United Nations celebrated the fact that for the first time in the history of humanity, the majority of the world population resided in urban environment. The United Nations found appropriate to celebrate this development, arguing obviously that urbanization opens up to people, many, many forms opens them up to new possibility, to more rich forms of life. Didn't mention that many of the people displaced from the rural area actually and in refugee camps, and also that in the urban areas, what we have seen is the growth of communities in which people live from hand to mouth, trying to eke out a living with all kinds of forms of informal labor, which barely enable them to survive. At the same time, that we need these broad movements, as I said, against war, against unjust the trade agreement, and the international organizations that are pushing towards privatization of property and the dispossession. We're also seeing the need, to create, a process of reappropriation of the resources that are most important for our life and recreation of our community. In other words, a reorganization, reconstruction of commons. I would say that without such reconstruction, the large movements against war, against dispossession, and for a different kind of society, for a systemic change, will remain futile, The struggle for the commons and the struggle against a process of capitalist development that is destroying more and more our life, that process needs to have a concrete base. What we call commons today are the constructive side of a broader anti-capitalist struggle. They cannot be successful if it is a purely negative struggle, a purely oppositional struggle. Because so much of the land, so much of the wealth of the world has been lost. That what we need is a process also of reclamation. And more importantly, we need a process that gives a material basis to people resistance. There cannot be any real forms of resistance if the people engaged in it do not have at the same time a material basis on which to sustain their struggle. And in particular, if we do not have a recreation of those communal bonds, bonds of reciprocity, bonds of solidarity that have been historically characteristic, and bonds that are, fundamentally based in collective decision making, that are historically been the main characteristic of the commons. Now, clearly, what the commons represent today, they represent many, many different things. They are also the possibility to undermine what is one of the most obstacles in the achievement of a just society, which is a colonial, racist, unequal international division of labor, whereby the provision of a limited prosperity, of a prosperity for limited community, is in fact built upon, premised upon, the immiseration of the many, the dispossession of the many. It's an international division of labor, such that those more and more, as we know, from our everyday experience, those who are producing the food that, for example, many communities would eat in the United States or Europe, the clothing that people would wear, are in fact produced by people who will not consume that food. In fact, whose land have been taken away precisely to produce food for export. It's by people who will not wear the clothing that they are producing, and who in fact will produce those clothing in condition, or for the matter, digital equipment, under conditions that practically destroy their life. As we know, much of production that is imported into the United States, for example, takes place in free export zones, which are free, where the freedom is non-existent, because it's freed from regulation. The freedom is only a freedom from the masters, because the production takes place without any type of regulation concerning hours of work, conditions of safety, and so in order to undermine, this unjust, unequal division of labor, what needs to occur is in fact a process of relocalization. It's a process of deglobalization, whereby we in fact create new forms of self-sufficiency, new forms of autonomy in our reproduction of the daily life. I want to quote here and make reference here to the work of very important feminist theoretician, Maria Mies, who died last year, about a year ago. She died on May 15, and who has written extensively on the common in her work, Patriarchy and Accumulation on a World Scale, and particularly one of our last work, which is the subsistent perspective, which is in fact practically a book which is dedicated, to the condition for the reconstruction of new commons. And I really suggest that this book should be on everybody's readers list if they have not already. And Mia pointed out something very important concerning the effects of the International Division of Labor as it is today, which is that the continuous growing separation between the places of production and the places of consumption is generating a process of not only involuntary complicity in many labor abuses and dispossession, but it's creating also a sense of irresponsibility, because those who are consuming products that come from export, many times from across an ocean, right, have no idea. We have no idea of the condition under which those products have been produced, what they have cost in terms of impoverishment, in terms of abuse, in terms of human life. So she insisted that we cannot think of constructing new commons, that one of the conditions, the fundamental condition for the construction of new commons has to be, the end of the separation between production and consumption, so that those who actually consume are the same who are those actually producing the food, the clothing, the whatever materials we need for our reproduction. And therefore, she insisted that one of the steps that we need to make, other step for the reconstruction of commons, has to be also a rethinking, restructuring of our process of consumption as well, in a way to eliminate anything that is not necessary for the satisfaction of our basic needs. Because the misery, the immiseration and impoverishment and dispossession that of course is characteristic of many parts of the world has been matched, of course, by the excessive forms of consumption, in some cases individual and social, in the so-called developed world. Consumption, much of which in fact, terminate in waste, which becomes another form of poisoning, becomes another form of destruction internationally. And in fact, Maria Mies had also a great proposal, which was that we should think of waste. And first of all, not only with in mind of reducing the production of waste, which is facilitated by the restoration of the metabolic cycles of the earth, but also that we look today, in our metropolis, we begin to look at waste as our responsibility as a negative common, but as something for which we take responsibility so that we do not contribute, with our disposal of waste to further poison the earth. So the idea, the question of the commons really fundamentally is a question of recreating communities, recreating ties of solidarity, recreating that vision of what constitutes a good life that can, in fact, guarantee that within a community we do not have processes of exploitation of each other and also exploitation of the natural world. It was mentioned before that, in fact, the commons have histories that are not always unblemished, even to the present. Keeping in mind, of course, the many communal forms of production that exist today, for instance, in the Americas, Mexico, Guatemala, where indigenous people far more, have conducted for years and years a struggle to maintain their communal forms of existence. And it was mentioned properly, and I referred to it in my own work, that, today in some of these communities, a struggle is taking place, led by women, in order to eliminate the patriarchal elements that have characterized some of this community in terms of women's participation to the decision-making, women participation to assemblies in which collective decisions are taken. At the same time, some of the women who have been most vocal about the need to change, to challenge patriarchal aspects that are evident in some communal forms of existence. And here, one of the references I've often made has been to the work of the feminist social scientist, sociologist, Gladys Tsutsur, who has written several books on what the commons have meant in the history of our community in the highland of Guatemala, the community of Totonicapan, the canton of Totonicapan. And she's been very interested in looking at the different ways in which this community has been able to maintain its cohesion, despite the fact of being continuously under siege, by capital and the state, and yet have been able to maintain such ties whereby those who are still born into it, from a very early phase in life, have a sense that their life should not be directed only to their own interest, but should be directed to the interest of the community as a whole. So the very early in life, a child at 9 or 10 is told some of the things he can do. And so this ability to go beyond, individualism, an individualistic conception of life that in the United States, so often by so many, is seen as a burden, is seen as a so-called limit of our fundamental freedom. In fact, in the eyes, in the writing of Gladys Tsutsur, as a sense of security and strength in the facing of the world, knowing that you are not only alone, but you're actually part of a whole, and that whole sustains you, and that you're not isolated, alone in front of the forces, particularly that today are actually, managing and, basically destroying so many forms of existence. So, but what is interesting in the struggle that feminists are making, to depatriarchalize the commons, is the realization that short of this depatriarchalization, it will be difficult for many commons to survive, because part of the strategy that international institutions, aided often by neoliberal feminists, are applying, to carry on their drive towards displacement, dispossession, the opening, which at the service of opening, new territory, new region, to investment, to new forms of extraction, that the inability to eliminate this form of patriarchalism, will make the commons, the community involved, more vulnerable. Yeah, more vulnerable, because today, women's equality often is misused in ways that actually serve an opposite purpose. So the construction of the commons, reconstruction of the commons, obviously cannot be thought of and carried out in a form that is blind to the possible limitation, particularly which are very, very, very besieging the commons at every side, considering that communal forms of reproduction, are existing today in a sea of capitalist relation. And therefore, they are continuously threatened and continuously forced to come to compromises. And of course, these compromises are at times, very, very destructive, can be extremely destructive. At the same time, it is also important to see that despite all the difficulties that today the construction of commons poses, and nevertheless, when we speak of commons, we do not speak of a utopia. We do not speak of a utopia. Actually, we speak of something that in different ways is already, we're speaking of a vast continent of practices, of activities that in many different ways are now reconfiguring communities in all the continent, in every part, beginning with the United States. And here the list, of course, is very long, but certainly the whole movement, for regional economies, the movement for sustainable agriculture and relocalization are really very much part of the construction of communal forms of production. The movement for degrowth, for food sovereignty, and here I'm thinking particularly of movement like Via Campesina, and more important, the many, many movements that are, both opposing, the devastation produced by extractivist politics, and at the same time constructing, new forms of alliances. For example, between, as in many cases in Latin America, between urban movement and rural movement, and movement particularly led by women, who are in fact reconstructing, the relationship that has been traditionally typical of more indigenous communities, particularly reconstructing a relationship with the land, and not only the land as intended as a condition for economic survival, but also the land as a relationship with the whole world of forces, of a world of spirituality, which is very, very necessary, to give cohesion to a community and to give the sense, a strength, to face, the deadly forces that are surrounding us. So I think that, for instance, the violence that we have seen mounting in recent years against women, particularly in every part, mostly in Latin America, in Africa, has been a direct response to this kind of leadership that women have made in the reconstruction of the commons. Realizing that, for instance, commoning everyday life, commoning the most important forms of our reproduction, it's really a condition, not only for survival, because of the pooling of resources, because of the sharing of the work, right? But it's also a condition for the possibility, of self-defense in front of the state. And it's also a possibility, for the expansion of our imagination concerning what is possible, concerning what kind of society we want to build. That is in a collectivity. It's in a process in which we are not isolated. We don't think of ourselves in isolation, but we think in ourselves in conjunction with our people, where we see, our body, our life, extending to others, extending also to the natural world. Sorry, I forgot to disconnect my phone. I'm very distraught. So that seeing that they're coming together, it's in fact, again, not only an economic necessity, but it's a necessity to have more power in relationship to capital, to the state, to the transnational companies that are coming into the communities, and also to expand, imagination of what it is possible, right? That this is really a condition, for the building of a different society, for the building of a different society. I think if it is something that it is happening more and more today, both as a result, of the massive devastation that we are witnessing, both as a consequence of global warming that is projecting a world, a terrifying world, in which the earth will be desertified, in which water will be missing, and we will not be able to survive the heat, particularly in certain parts of the year. That this terrifying, added to the constant escalation of warfare and the prospect now of a new global war, the rhetoric that we hear coming from Washington is certainly a rhetoric of war, preparation of war with China, or certainly of devolving massive resources in addition to those that are now being sent to Israel to destroy the life of the Palestinians, in front of the continuous warfare. And parallel, consequent to it, the diminishing investment in forms of social reproduction. This whole prospect a very terrifying future. And it's a future in which, yes, it may appear naive to think of the common, but at the same time, makes the question of the commons, the question of reclaiming land, reclaiming means of reproduction of all type, reclaiming the condition, material condition, spiritual condition of solidarity, is becoming more and more imperative. And as I mentioned before, often, the construction of a common begins with something that may appear limited, may appear quite modest. And we may wonder, can we speak of a common in that way? No, but here I want to mention, again, another book and another important feminist social writer, Kirsten Ross, who has written a very, very powerful book. If you're interested in the question of the common, Kirsten Ross' book called Notav, Zad and Notav, it's a book to read. And Zad means zone à défendre, zone to be defended. And it refers to a very epic battle that began in 2008 in Western France at the periphery of Nantes. And it was an effort by a community largely of peasants to oppose the construction of an airport, which would have destroyed at least 4,000 acres of land. And that began a long, long process of struggle that continues into the present, and which in fact has generated many other similar struggling throughout France. So the zone à défendre has become a general term for the ecological struggle in France. And after the first powerful and very, very violent clashes with the police, who came and attacked this community as they were criminals, something that is happening now on our campuses. And the violence was such that it brought the issue of ZAD to the national attention. And what began to happen is that more and more people began to converge on the areas, and many remained. And so what Ross describes is that very soon, a struggle for the commons that begins with the defense of the land, the defense of a peasant way of living against the building of an airport, becomes something much broader, much more powerful. It becomes an indictment of a whole system that structurally subordinates life, to the acquisition, of wealth, and, camouflage as technological development, as progress, and so forth. And she also showed that, over time, the ties, the affective ties, the new relationship, the kind of new world that was built in the process of the struggle, that the struggle itself was generative. The struggle itself that begins with opposition to the airport becomes very generative of a whole new world of communal ties. It creates a community. It's not only the community that struggle, but the struggle produces the community. And produces also new forms of reproduction, because many of those who had joined to defend the peasants actually decided to stay and become part of those communities. So that the struggle itself then becomes a struggle to defend those relations, those affectivity, defend, those solidarity, so that the idea we should not be in a sense limited, when we think of commons, by the appearance that in many cases, they seem to have limited goals. An urban garden, for instance, right? Some forms of urban farming. But nevertheless, actually the struggle itself producing something new and broadens the imagination, of what is possible. And I want to, and of course, important to say that when we speak of, for instance, defending and commoning the material condition of our reproduction, and we speak of land, we speak of the relationship to the water, to the air, which are really the fundamental condition of existence. We also speak of knowledges with the destruction, of ecological system, whole system of knowledges and culture, all cultural forms, are also being destroyed. This is extremely important to see that the defense of land, when we say land, we say something much broader, right? But certainly the question of land in its very broad sense remains fundamental, because you cannot struggle, you cannot achieve real forms of autonomy unless you have some forms of control over the material condition of your reproduction. And this is why, for instance, the question of digital commons is so problematic, because on one side we can all appreciate certain forms of connectivity, although that too has its own problem. But when we speak of commons, we have to look at how they are produced. And much digital commoning is produced through the destruction of earthly commons. The case of Africa, I think, is outstanding. Many of the wars that have been taking place in Africa, and now we have the Sudan. Imagine 8 million displaced, 8 million people displaced. And of course, the Congo. And of course, many of the struggles of the bloody, called counterinsurgency or struggle in the Congo, in Africa as a whole, have at their roots, the need for transnational corporation to appropriate the mineral, not only the petroleum, but the minerals that are essential for the production of digital economies. Consequently, it's difficult to speak of digital commons if the very instruments that are necessary for the production of these commons are in fact based upon the destruction, of the community and of people and the ecological system of people across the world. So we have to be extremely careful when we speak of what we mean by commons, whether they are truly forms of existence that are in fact, benefiting, enhancing, our living possibility and enhancing the living possibility of the earth, or they are in fact in some ways contributing to the destruction. So there is no model conclusion. There is no real unique model of commons. I understand that you're doing great work, and I was not able to read carefully enough the papers that were uploaded. And I regret it, because I wish I could have referred more directly, my comments to those papers. But, I would say that there is no universal model of commons, that when it comes to think of what is a good common, I always adopt the principle of the Zapatista, which is no to any universal model. No, the only thing that is universal in thinking of what is the good life, right, is a negative one. The only universal condition is the refusal of exploitation of human beings and nature. That has to be a universal no to a life produced on the misery, on exploitation, on dispossession, on individual self-interest. And many, many yeses, many, many yeses, many, many roads, many paths, many forms, many cultural, translation of what it could mean a good life. Because after all, in correspondence, this corresponds to the great diversity of trajectory, historical, cultural, climatic trajectories, condition in which people are constructing a new life. And to conclude my comments, and I want to return to the issue of Palestine. I want to quote here, mention an article that Peter Limbaugh, I imagine you all know Peter Limbaugh because he's one of the main writers on the question of the common, the Magna Carta Manifesto. And he has recently published, I think, in Counterpunch, as well as another journal, an article called Palestine Commons. And it's an article that looks at a big historical analysis of what was called the Musha, which was a village-based agriculture, a common in forms of agriculture typical of historical Palestine that sustained the Palestinian people in their struggle against the Ottoman Empire. And Limbaugh points out how the profound communal ties that form of village life that persisted for many, many years, has sedimented a solidarity, a sense of solidarity. It has enabled the Palestinian people to survive for decades, even in refugee camp, even under continuous colonial occupation, and a constant deprivation of human rights that have transformed Palestine in what has been described as an open-air prison. And, we see, as Limbaugh points out, that spirit of the Musha, still vibrating, in, for example, the work of the doctor, the work of the journalist, the work of the many people, in condition of a true hell, regardless of the danger of their life, regardless of also what is being done to their families, are continuously to fight, are continuously to devote the last of their energy to save the people, around them. So, in conclusion, it seems to me that withdrawing our allegiance, to state and capital, to the forces that today are destroying the Palestinian community, as they are destroying many other communities across the world. It's really, has to be accompanied. It's not only really indispensable to think of a life that, where disregard for human beings becomes the law of the land, right? But also to reconstruct a sense of possibility, right? To reconstruct, a hope in a future. And within this context, the idea of the commons in all its variety, all its limit, all its contradiction in the present form, and all its struggle, still represents the seed, still represents the vision of a post-capitalist, more just society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that critically illuminating and inspiring talk, Professor Federici. I'm going to run a discussion session here, and just as a way to kick it off, I'd like to pose two related questions to you. So you began your talk with describing the situation in Gaza, the Gaza war. And the question I had was whether you thought that capitalism and its economic logic alone can adequately explain what is going on in Gaza. I mean, so for example, does it matter that Israel is an ethno-nationalist state? Does it matter that Israel is a settler colonial state with its distinct logic of elimination, to quote Patrick Wolf? So that's really to ask, in many ways, ask you to think about the specificity of the political form. Like, does that matter? Or are they all just sort of, expressions of capitalism and its drive for accumulation? The second question, which is related, I think, is what is the role of the state in your political vision? And I'm sure you've been asked this before, but I think it would be helpful for us here to understand. Because of the economic, or I should say really the global character of all the crises that we face right now, humanitarian, right, human rights, environmental, et cetera, can we really do without the state and focus exclusively on the commons? Or put otherwise, is it commons versus state, or do you see a way of imagining state forms that are compatible with your idea of the commons? So this is another way, let me phrase it this way, like I really appreciate your emphasis on local practices of struggle. I'm just wondering whether there are any limits in your view to the politics of the local, given the global character of the crises we face. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those great questions. Well, the first one, I think is very important to understand, in answer to, it's very important to understand two things. What has been the role of Israel, in the post-war period since today? Basically, Israel has been the protector of the oil fields. It has been, given the task to ensure that British American companies would have, unchallenged access to the great wealth of the Middle East, and also together with it to ensure that the demand of new generation of people in the Middle East, Arab, Palestinian, would not be met. The demand of reclaiming their land, re-establishing sovereignty over their land, that these demands, very legitimate demands, will be suffocated. So I would say, basically, this is to say that there's been a very strong political economic motive in the great support that the United States and European Union more and more have given. In 1986, Biden was quoted saying that if Israel didn't exist, we would have to invent it, because he did such a powerful job. And in fact, he kind of specialized in system of repression, which it exported all over the world. Now Israel is one of the, leaders in the world in technology of surveillance. Israeli drones are patrolling the Mediterranean, making sure, for example, the boats of immigrants do not reach the European destination, et cetera, et cetera. We can go a long, long way with it. So I would say this is where I see the powerful continuity. Undoubtedly, undoubtedly, there's something quite exceptional, both in the extremity of the destruction, and really the cruelty, but and also in the fact that it is happening in the eyes of the world, and there's no attempt to really mask it. Of course, this incredibly absurd policy of telling people, no, you cannot say this, you cannot say that, everything is anti-Semitic, is a reflection of the fact that the state knows that everybody sees what is happening, and only by pure force they can actually silence it. They can only silence people, not by any evidence. But what I wanted to stress is that there is a continuity. So these are aspects that make it somewhat exceptional. And when you talk about the ethno-fascism, I'll call it this way, then I would say system of exclusions are necessary for every society that is built on dispossession, that is built on a colonial structure. So it's not arbitrary that we find, this basically privilege given to one people that we now see with Moody in India. In fact, it's becoming a pattern, because this enables, justifies, right? And it's a divisive mechanism. In other words, in order to dispossess large population, you have to use a lot of repressive, you have to use a lot of warfare and arms and police, but you also have to divide people. A united people, a people who is cohesive and is united, cannot be completely defeated. Because among other things, you need to have people to join armies, you need to have people to collaborate in their repression. So instruments of division have to be continuously created. I mean, to give you an example, when I spoke about the destruction of the commons and land in Africa, we have seen a return of witch hunting. I've been writing about it in my work, right? So accusing particularly women and women with land, women who are fighting, holding on to land, accusing them of witchcraft, has been a tool of dispossession. Never would have imagined, when I began to work on Caliban and the Witch, that in my own lifetime, I would have seen women burnt. More recently, for example, in the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil, in March of 2023, a woman leader of the Guarani, who was fighting against the company, coming in and pushing for takeover of communal land, for the cultivation of soya, was accused of being a witch, and she was burnt alive. Actually, they burnt her in her house, they burnt her house, her and her companion. So this system of exclusion are very, very much necessary. But what I wanted to stress was the continuity, because what we have seen, if we could see in the same graphic way that we see the destruction of Palestine, what has been taking place in so many communities across the world, as a result, for instance, of the structural adjustment program that have practically demolished, the social reproduction investment of the state, that have privatized land, forced government to reorient their economy towards export, forced them to accept extractivist companies, forced them to accept free export zone. If we could see the consequences, for instance, Africa has been devastated by epidemics, not only by wars, but by epidemics. They never received the attention that COVID received, but it's been really devastated. I spent a lot of time in Africa in the 80s. And I saw with my eyes some of the destruction that it was produced. And in a place where still in the 80s, you had communal forms of agriculture, which are now being really very much under attack, in many cases destroyed. Yeah. So I think there is a continuity. The political economy, the accumulation of wealth is always, 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 in the shadow of all these genocidal forms of war. And it's very interesting, in fact, with a different, that war itself today is more and more intended to destroy reproductive infrastructure, to destroy what people need for their reproduction, so that people continue to die long before the bombing is finished. Like this is the case of the war of the United States in Iraq, for example. So the water system. But you had a second question,
Yeah,
and maybe.
May I just, because I don't want to totally monopolize this discussion, because we only have about another 5 minutes left or so.
Oh,
and
no.
there may be, that's okay, we can be in touch about the other question. That I want to just see if there are other questions that the audience has. Do you mind? So let me just see. Anyone? It's got to be someone. There we go, back there.
Hello. Thank you
Yes.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you so much for this fascinating talk. I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the strategy, because what I found really compelling about your talk was this imagining and looking for different avenues of production and the emphasis in the commons and how it opens a moral or an ethical space of cooperation. And I think it relates to Linda's question, but I wonder, and you mentioned it during the talk, but if you could talk a little bit more, I think it would be helpful. There is a tension in this kind of downscaling and going into this very local forms of productions through the commons, and the fact that capital is, more global and massive. And I wonder is this a call for, anti-modernity and just live outside the structure of capital today, or is there a way in which the commons directly challenge the structures, the economic structures of capital that are globalized?
Well, that in a way, it seems to me that if I understand, because there was an echo, and so I didn't understand all the words, but it seems to me that your question, in a way, it's very similar to the second question you had, right? It's the question of the local versus the broader picture, and also there was a question about the state. Right? So yeah, I preface my introduction to the question of the commons, saying that the trends that we see now towards large-scale enclosure, large-scale dispossession, permanent warfare to sustain it, can only be contrasted by broad movements. For example, anti-war. We need an anti-war movement, also feminist anti-war movement. We need people to fight. And honestly, what we see now on the campus in the United States is very, very, very powerful. And I want to cheer with the many students and teachers who are now coming out and protesting. But we need these movements. But at the same time, I think it is very important. It's not the local, is not disconnected from the global. I think we have now, since the anti-globalization movement, we have seen that the local, and also the question of how does a population, a large world population that is being constantly disrupted in its capacity, in its forms of reproduction, and in its solidarity ties, family ties, ties to the land, ties to the community, how they are going to be able to actually confront the powers of the state, the powers of capital, so that, yes, the broad movement, but these movements have to have a concrete grounding. They have to concrete grounding. They have to be able to refer to territory, to land, to resources, and to specific ties, to strong ties. You have to know the people you're fighting for, you're fighting with. You have to develop effective ties. This is what enabled the people of the ZAD, at Notre-Dame-des-Landes in France, to continue the struggle over the years and to fight, to prevail over a very, very violent police repression. It is because you rather die than to leave that land. You rather die than not to move when your friend is being attacked. Those solidarity ties are what make the common. Peter Limbaud always talked about no commons commoning, to stress what, and Maria means too, that the heart of the commons is the relationship, is both the land, the material condition, but also the relationship, the solidarity, the interconnectedness, right? The reciprocity, interdependence. All of that is the life of the commons. And the question of the state.
Professor Federici, unfortunately, are we really out of time? I didn't make the schedule. I just have the unfortunate role of enforcing it. So we want to take the time to thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you. Sorry for this.
Thanks again. We look forward to hearing from you again. Bye-bye.